Frankie-san was born September 29th in September 1929 in Tokyo, Japan. Growing up, he embraced Buddhism, and then later his mother's religion, Shintoism. But he also had a strong belief in emperor worship. The Japanese emperor was God, and you died for your God. In 1944, at the age of 14, Frankie-san joined the Japanese Navy, and he trained as a kamikaze. It's not the kamikaze in the sense that you might think, because at that time Japan was expecting a land invasion. Frankie was trained to carry a mine into a tank. To die for your emperor was the greatest honor, and to die in battle would earn you a special place But then 15 months later, all of that would change. It was 15 months later when the atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Japan was in ruins. Food became scarce. Black markets were everywhere. Frankie's life began to become more and more filled with depression as situations in Japan grew more desperate and they were dealing with the shame of their defeat. Frankie was seeking some kind of meaning in life and not finding much. Ultimately, Frankie bought sleeping pills, down 10 of them, with the intention of taking his life. But he did wake up the next day. Striving to find meaning, Frankie attended Hosei University in Tokyo. But that wasn't helping. He was not finding the meaning he was seeking. One evening, he's standing, while attending Hosei University, and standing on a train station platform, Frankie started hearing this song that reached out to him, that touched his heart. That song was "Softly and Sweetly, Jesus is Calling." Eventually, Frankie would run into a young missionary who was leading a Bible study in his home, and it was there that Frankie for the first time heard the gospel. He heard and learned of this God who willingly dies for the sake of his people. With the help of the missionary and with some local Air Force military people, Frankie was able to journey to America with the intention of starting seminary at Columbia Bible College, which is now known as CIU. After stopping in San Francisco and working for a while to build up more money to make his final trip to Columbia, Frankie, in 1961 of September, would become enrolled in Columbia Bible College. But he didn't quite care for it. They were too conservative for his taste. He couldn't quite fit in there. Eventually, Frankie would be introduced to Dr. Reinhardt's, as you know, Reinhardt's Hall here. And Dr. Reinhardt's would arrange for Frankie to attend LTSS. There were two key figures at LTSS who were big in supporting and helping Frankie. The first, of course, was Dr. Reinhardt's. The second was Frankie's roommate, Peter Setzer, who took Frankie under his wing. In one of the Cell 55 newsletters, there's an article that Peter writes about Frankie. And he talks about they couldn't have been more different from each other. You had this little 5-foot man from the East and this big guy, big old Western guy. One of the articles, he says, here I am putting up my spurs and my ropes and my whips, and over on Frankie's side, he's got his kimonos and his dolls and his tea. Peter did a lot to help Frankie with his studies. And in return, Frankie actually would wash Peter's clothes, initially much to Peter's disagreement. I think one of the other funniest stories about that is Peter would Peter would say that Frankie would eat stuff that he wouldn't eat on a dare. Dr. Reinhardt he would call a guardian, counselor, and friend, and as he said in his 1976 issue of his Cell 55 newsletter, someone he adopted as his father. While attending LTSS, Frankie got a job down at Angelo's, and as he's inside working, he sees these buses with men in them, with bars on the windows. They keep passing by, and he gets curious, and he asks, "Who are those people?" The guy working with him laughs and goes, "Oh, they're jailbirds." And Frankie says, "I haven't heard of a jailbird." So they explained to him these were men that were in prison and going out on work duty. Frankie's heart went out to them. In fact, he would go out on the corner every day as they passed by and bow to them, which is a sign of respect in his culture. And it became such a thing that the men inside the bus would rush to the side of the window just to see Frankie bow to them.
One of really the few other experiences that I had with Frankie was when we first met him, and it was a very small group, part of the Lutheran student movement at the time, and maybe 10 of us gathered together, and we enjoyed a meal afterwards. But much like the story about the inmates at CCI that told me their opinion of him, that was my impression too when I first met him. It was like, this is a really interesting fellow, because when I hear, "Oh, I'm doing prison ministry,"
Yeah.
I've been there before. I've been to 3 maximum security prisons, and mingled with folks. Generally, I think, right, the idea is, "Oh, I'm doing prison ministry. I'm going to bring them the good word. I'm going to bring them this. I'm going to introduce them to this service. I'm going to teach them this. I'm going to teach them that." And Frankie took a very different approach, right? It's like, what do you need?
Yeah.
Right. And it wasn't books. It wasn't, right, arranging conjugal visits or whatever else one might think,
Yeah.
right, prisoners would ask for. They wanted flip-flops that they could wear in the shower. And having later been in the prison and seen the showers, I understand why that would be a concern.
Yeah.
And that's what Frankie did, right? That's why he was there, and that's what his mission was at that particular time. That I met him was to, just trying to raise just really minimal amount. I think he was looking for enough cash to buy like 150 pairs or something of flip-flops, right? Not because he felt like that's the ministry that the prisoners needed, but because the minister said, "This is what we need." And that was refreshing to see. And that, yeah, and that was really sort of my perspective as well. Probably one of the reasons that I was allowed to be one of the ones that could actually go in and teach. It's about, if we take this idea of forgiveness and human dignity and human worth seriously, you just kind of have to do that, and and not even forgive or overlook what folks have done, right? Because somebody else is taking care of that for us, right? But just treat them as you find them. And, I think Frankie did that with everyone.
I'm trying to remember, was it CCI where Frankie had built that little oasis they talk about, the library?
Yeah, he had a little library there, and he would take a little push cart, right? When he was delivering books, he had a little push cart that he would take by, and folks could take, I think, a maximum of 2 books, maybe. every time that he came through. Pretty limited selection once he realized what people enjoy reading, or they would tell him. But mostly, I think he sort of intuited what they were leaning towards. He would make sure that he had some of those books right on the shelves for his regular readers.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah,
and then when he went to KCI, I think is when he switched more towards the HIV and AIDS ministry, as I understand it, assistance to people who at the time, it was a fatal, it was really kind of terminal, right?
Yeah.
Early 90s certainly didn't have the sort of medications and treatments that we do today. Governmental service, right? To come in and say, this is what we think you need, and just getting it very wrong. So it's nice to keep Frankie's model there as a way that says, nah, maybe you don't have all the answers, right? And you need to listen to them.
Yep.
Listen to the people.
His compassion for these men encouraged him to enter prison ministry. Not only prison ministry in CCI, one of the most notorious prisons in South Carolina. But Frankie always said, it doesn't matter what these men have done. They're human beings, and I will treat them as such. As part of his attempts to take care of the men in CCI, Frankie would start the Cell 55 newsletter. In it, he would write personal stories. Other people would write in. That was his way of letting people outside the prison system know what his people needed. And as you heard my brother on the interview, it wasn't what he thought they needed. It was what they truly needed. Frankie also crafted a little library in CCI, which was described as an oasis in what was otherwise hell. He would have animals and birds and plants, and it became a place many people enjoyed going. Later in his ministry, Frankie would, as CCI was closing, as you heard my brother also say, Frankie would devote his time to working with the Health Services Department of Corrections and crafted a new ministry in which he ministered to people, to AIDS victims and those dying within the state federal prison. And what was so unique about that is he did it at a time when AIDS was still relatively unknown, and the thought was you didn't get in the same room with someone because you might catch it. Frankie would be there by their sides, putting arms around them, taking their hands. He was a man who truly gave his life in the service of Christ. He was a truly bright and shining light for Christ, someone who understood what it meant to live out the gospel. That's not to say he didn't have a sense of humor. There were many times that Frankie would come into the prison dressed as Santa Claus or the Easter Bunny, or as you will see with the last clip, he actually posed for a mugshot, and it said wanted for life sentence, and it said for spreading the gospel under it all. This has been a very brief introduction to the life of Frankie Son. If you would like to learn more about the life of Frankie Son, I recommend the book Frankie Son, A Bright and Shining Light for Christ. There's also many Cell 55 newsletters that are in the archives. Frankie has currently retired in his 90s. He's suffering dementia right now and is living in a retirement home. Thank you for your time, and I hope that you enjoyed this presentation.